Hello and welcome to the weekly climate show. A look at what's got my pulse racing or blood boiling in recent days. And this show is all heat and dust, also known as weather and weathering, with maybe a casual glance at a sweaty week in Westminster. Now, amongst the many downsides of climate change, one I feel acutely right now is how it saps the simple pleasure of a hot summer's day. My relaxed basking and daytime drinking is disrupted by thoughts of planetary peril, and now personal peril, as the first national emergency for extreme heat has been declared for early next week, with the UK Health Security Agency saying the risks of illness or death apply to normally fit and healthy people. Well, just before warming further to this theme, a quick nod to viewers in the west of Scotland. I know you've had it miserable, wet and cold while reading headlines about heat waves. But you are the exception, and it's not just much of the UK where the mercury is rising. Much of the northern hemisphere is enduring unusual heat. In America, 50 million people are living with heat alerts. China has seen record temperatures reached in Shanghai, and here in Europe we've seen wildfires and health warnings as the thermometers pass 40 degrees Celsius. And here in the studio I've got a friend to talk about all this, Sky's science correspondent Thomas Moore. Thomas, is this the new normal?
It's certainly what climate predictions have suggested would happen for quite some time, and it's now coming to pass. In every country around the world, we're seeing temperatures climb, but in some areas it's climbing much faster, and that is the problem, that you're going to get much more intense heat waves in the decades to come.
And are we also seeing more blocky weather, if you like?
Yeah, and that's the really interesting thing, Tom, is that the jet stream is slowing down. So when you do get some weather patterns coming to a halt over areas, it's not only hotter, but it's hotter for longer. And if the ground starts to dry out, that water vapour would normally help to cool the air, but that's gone. And that does magnify the heat.
Yeah, I hear there's a lot from farmers that spells of weather are now lasting for weeks rather than days. Well, while you and I are stuck in the studio, some of our fellow correspondents have been out feeling the heat firsthand, and our climate correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter, has been in Portugal.
This has been an absolutely punishing heat wave for Portugal, and perhaps most obvious, of course, in the wildfires ripping through the north and centre of the country, and now in the south too. And climate change is driving the conditions that are making those experiences worse for the people who live in those communities. Underneath it all, you've got this incredible heat, this prolonged period of heat, which is making it very difficult for firefighters to battle those fires. But it's also incredibly dry. Around 96% of this country is under drought conditions. And what that means is that the forests in those hills where the wildfires have been doing the most damage are tinder dry, acting as kindling, helping these fires really to relight. As soon as the firefighters get one blaze under control, another pops up. Fire season in Portugal has extended over the years, and local residents told me that it's definitely getting worse. So what now? Climate change is impacting Portugal, and it's really the heat they are worried about, because it's not just dangerous in terms of wildfires and public health impacts. Heat's also really expensive because there's the cost of the emergency response, but also people are way less productive in significant heat events, understandably so. So I interviewed a senior politician, the Secretary of State for Home Affairs, Patricia Gaspar, who told me that the country has to shift its mindset to accept a new reality and to think really radically about altering the way this country lives its life, particularly in the high summer months. She was talking about making sure that big events don't happen in forested rural areas. She was discussing the possibility of thinking about altering core working hours in the hot summer months to help people avoid the hottest part of the day. These are big shifts that mimic what cities and communities in the global south have been doing for a long time, finding ways to work around the impact of heat. And the chief climate scientist at the country's National Weather Service said that this country must adapt because the forecasts in climate science are getting worse, and his main concern is that there's going to be a smaller and smaller gap between these extreme events. And unless there's adaptation, it's going to be harder and harder for this country to recover.
As Hannah said, climate change is beginning to change the pattern of people's lives in Portugal, a country which, like us, could once rely on the neighbouring Atlantic Ocean to shield them from extreme heat. Over in Germany, they're experiencing drought right now, with the Rhine running low, ironically on the anniversary of terrible floods which killed more than 180 people. Our Europe correspondent, Siobhan Robbins, takes up the story from a wine cellar.
So you join me in a wine cellar, and I'm down here because this is in the Ahr Valley, one of the areas which was devastated last year in the catastrophic floods that Germany experienced. And I've come down because vineyards and wine were one of the industries badly affected. And we can speak to Peter now. Peter, just tell me, how bad was the flooding here?
It was a total catastrophe inside of this cellar, completely flooded. I see you, maybe you can, I will show you this on the wall. So the water stands between the number 2 and number 3, and we are lost by night here in this cellar, in the tanks and barrels. 40,000 liters of wine and also 20,000 bottles inside are completely destroyed by night.
Wow, and you've got these bottles here. If you just show us some. These are bottles that were impacted in the flood, covered in mud, and I understand you're now auctioning them off now.
Yes, so we are also looking in the future, and we will be innovated, and so we make an NFT as this ones and this auction also, and we are looking for this one, what's happened with these flood wines. These are completely, everyone is flood wine, and every bottle looks different like the other ones, and it's a kind of art also, and a kind of remember at the catastrophe.
And all the money here will go to help the region rebuild.
Completely, yeah.
It's a difficult time for Germany, though, isn't it? Because the war in Ukraine has put severe pressure on your energy. Yet at the same time, all of us here in Europe are living through changing climate. There's heat waves, there's floods. For you, how difficult is it? Does climate still take a lead, or are you more focused on getting energy?
So for us here in this cellar, in the winery, so that's not be a problem. We are also changers. We are changers to wood power and restarting completely because everything was destroyed here. The heaters was destroyed, everything. And so, in time, we don't need gas inside this cellar.
Peter, thank you. And it's an interesting tug of war here in Germany, like many places around the world, because of the pressure on energy. Some people are questioning, is climate still as important? Should it take a back foot? Should we be using coal at the moment to plug the gap? At the moment, the majority of public is still saying that climate is important, but we're seeing every single day the impact of climate change on our lives.
And Thomas, I gather you've been out tree hugging in Guildford, looking at something that isn't necessarily a solution, but a cool adaptation to our sweltering cities.
Yes, very much so. Trees are nature's air conditioners, and they are that low-tech solution for what is a very big problem. That problem is the urban heat island effect, and that's when concrete jungles become extra hot. We know from studies in London and Manchester, the centres of them can be 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside. But even provincial towns, as small as Guildford, can have that effect too. And we went down to the University of Surrey and took a look at some of their data on Monday, and you can see 2 sensors there, one in the built-up area and one in parkland. And just watch what happens as the temperatures climb through the morning. Early afternoon, there is a 7-degree difference between them.
That's
temperatures,
stunning.
Absolutely stunning. Temperatures then cool through the afternoon and into the evening, but even at midnight, there is a 3-degree temperature difference between them. And that is why people in cities really do find it very difficult to sleep, but also people are exposed to the health effects of heat.
You mentioned the effect of concrete and hard surfaces, but expand on that a bit. And also, is there a kind of solution to this?
Yeah, so we had a go with a thermal camera just to illustrate the problem. And you can see that hard surfaces, asphalt, concrete, brick, steel, that absorbs the sun's energy and then radiates it back long into the night. But nature, trees, grassland, that's much cooler. And not only are trees casting shade, and it's cool blue in these pictures, but it's also evaporating water. The trees use some of the sun's energy to give off water, keeps them cool, but also cools the surrounding air. And that's really important in the years to come. People are saying we should plant more trees in cities because that will provide not only the shade, but the cooling effect.
Not just for beauty and habitat, but for keeping us cool too. Now, away from the cities, I noticed Forestry England encouraging us all to go down to the woods to chill. It's usually, as Thomas says, a few degrees cooler under the canopy. Now, we've got time for a little any other business. In the contest to be the new Prime Minister, the candidates are finally being asked about climate change, and we are seeing some rowing back from the firm 2050 net zero pledge. We'll have more on this when it's down to 2 candidates next week. But Thomas, you've been looking at a policy that was once claimed to be a measure to help the fight against global warming that's now coming under a major assault.
Very much so, and this is to do with biofuels. That's crops which are grown to be added to petrol and diesel that we stick in our cars. And the original idea had been that that would be carbon neutral, that the crops would absorb carbon from the atmosphere, and then when you burn them off in a car, they'd just give it back. And it should be net zero, but it's not. And that has been a big controversy for a long time. But there is one group now saying that because there is a big impact on food security with the war in Ukraine, a lot of biofuel crops are grown there. Now, if you stop this requirement for sticking biofuels in cars, those crops could be used for people. But in a sense, as I say, this is a controversy that's being raged for a while because land is finite. It's being asked to do more and more, isn't it, Tom, as you well know?
No, I was going to say that's such a big issue with biofuels because they really do gobble up a lot of acreage, and you've got to put all that diesel in there and fertiliser and all those things which do have climate change impacts. So.
For sure. I mean, it's not just growing food, it's absorbing carbon, it's growing biofuels. And, you know, if the population is going to grow by 2 billion people by 2050, that's a lot more land that's going to be needed just for food.
Thomas, thanks very much. We could chat on for a while. Of course, we do have extensive coverage of the heatwave online. For that and all our other climate coverage, just head to our website or the Sky News app. Well, later we'll be answering some of your questions. I love this question from Earl, who asked me on YouTube, my electricity bill is supposed to be 100% renewable and the production cost of those renewables has been going down. So how can they blame rising gas prices for my bill going up? Well, your answer when we come back. Welcome back to The Climate Show. Now, before the break, Earl asked us why his bills are still going up, despite having a renewables tariff, when it's fossil fuel prices that are rocketing. Well, for an answer, let's hear from our business correspondent, Helen Ann Smith.
Hi, Earl. Thanks for that question. The key reason for that is it's not your energy provider that distributes your energy. That still comes from the national grid. And crucially, it's physically impossible, the way the national grid is set up, for any one particular house to be supplied with just one energy source. Ofgem like to use the analogy of a smoothie. So the smoothie of different energy sources still supplies each house. And the more people who buy renewable tariffs, the more that the renewable part of that smoothie would go up. But there is still natural gas in there, nuclear and other things. And of course, that means that your tariff is still exposed to the gas price in that way. The other reason is because of the way that companies purchase renewable energy. So when you sign up to your tariff, your renewable tariff, your energy company has likely possibly invested in renewable energy to about the same kilowatts that it would take to power your house. That's kind of how the trade-off works. And unfortunately, the cost of that investment is also pretty exposed to the energy market more broadly. So the cost of your company paying for that renewable energy has likely also gone up because of the gas price going up, and that unfortunately gets passed on to you. I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
A revelation there that perhaps those 100% renewable tariffs aren't always quite what they seem. Now, as you may know by now, we love a climate change solution on this show, many of them high-tech, like last week's one involving graphene. So, a drum roll please for today's contender. A rock, basalt. A rock with some famous outcrops. This is Staffo with its distinctive basalt columns. And this is my effort at an album cover there with my boys. But that's enough holiday snaps. It's time for your 2 favourite lessons combined, geography and chemistry. Basalt has been capturing carbon for millennia in a process known as weathering. Carbon dioxide mixes with rainwater in the air to form a weak acid, and when that falls on rocks like basalt, it reacts, combining CO2 with chemicals in the rock to make carbonate and bicarbonate molecules. These then wash off the mountain into the soil, where it helps to make them more fertile, and into the ocean, where it makes seawater less acidic. Wherever it ends up, the carbon is captured for millions of years. And now, when CO2 removal is urgent, we've discovered a way to accelerate the process called enhanced weathering. Basalt is found in pockets across much of the north and west of the country, including at this quarry in Fife. Basalt is a foundation stone of our economy. 39 million tonnes are dug from Britain each year, used in everything from roads to aircraft engines. Here, big boulders are shifted, then crushed into smaller chunks, ready for different customers. But there are leftovers that carbon capture company Undo have their eye on.
So this is an aggregate which is produced to make concrete with. So concrete goes into building foundations and building constructions throughout the United Kingdom. Over this side, we have a 14 to 6 mil product which is used to make asphalt. So that goes into tarmac to make roads with. The byproduct, the material here, is what we're interested in. This is the Undo fine granule material. And as you can see, it comes out in enormous quantities.
Until you got here, this would have been a waste product.
Yes, it was, yes. And now we're finding a use for it.
That use is getting paid in carbon credits for shifting it and spreading it on farmland. What are you digging out to show me there?
I'm wanting to show you the particle size. The increased surface area in this material is where we're wanting to hit and capture the carbon.
What do you think when you see a huge pile like this, of the potential of it?
What do I think? I think win, win, win. Never mind building another rocket to the moon. It's here, it's around us, it's under our feet, and we should be getting on with it.
Jennifer's excitement is shared by many scientists. A recent report from Sheffield University said spreading rock dust would be a huge step to meeting our net zero targets, and used globally could absorb 5% of the world's CO2 emissions.
When we're using this dust, we are capturing the carbon for hundreds of thousands of years. This is a simple way, right under our feet, that we should be realising now. We don't have to build massive plants. We don't have to build a massive infrastructure. It's here. It's nature's energy, and we should be using it.
At the moment, you've got quarrying, transport and spreading, all of which use fossil fuels. That's got to undermine this idea a little bit, hasn't it?
We do have to take that in account. So we know we're capturing X amount of carbon. We have to subtract 5% of that for the trucking operation. We've got 95%. We've captured it.
But keeping that figure low means loads only go to farms within 50 miles of the quarry. And this load of dust has come about 40 miles to a farm here. It's then spread across 450 acres, where, alongside helping the climate, the minerals help the crops too. And what's going to be growing out of this field in a few months?
Winter wheat will follow this, not that there's much to see at the moment.
What are you hoping spreading this stuff will do for the crop that grows here?
Well, hopefully improve its health, therefore we won't have to use as many fungicides, fertilisers.
And what about the climate benefit? Does that mean anything to you as well?
That's of interest to me, but that's secondary to me growing my crop.
A waste material that could fight climate change and grow more food. No wonder it's being nicknamed magic dust. Well, who would have thought that the simple elements of water and rock could make such a difference to our climate? Sorry, someone's going to have to clean that up later, but we do still have time to answer a couple of the questions you've been sending in. And James asked via our app, whenever temperature is mentioned, it's always hottest since records began. When did records begin? Given the Earth is over 4 billion years old, what were temperatures like 1,000 years ago? 10,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago? Well, James, the oldest continuous temperature record began in 1659. It's called the Central England Temperature Data Series, but there's not really enough data before the year 1880 for scientists to estimate the average temperature for the planet. For the thousands of years before then, scientists used proxy measures like these ice cores, drilling into old ice and analysing trapped air bubbles for evidence of past weather. The oldest continuous ice cores in Antarctica stretch back 800,000 years, and the rise in temperature corresponds to a rise in CO2 in the atmosphere. And now a question from Rishi, and presumably not that one. What measures can be put in place in the summer to prevent people from getting seriously ill or dying? And will new UK houses have to be built differently to be cooler? Radhika Khosla is one of the world's leading experts on cooling.
4 key ways to adapt to extreme heat. 1, make sure that everyone stays hydrated and stays out of the sun. 2nd, to make sure that when cooling appliances are purchased, whether they are fans or whether they are air conditioners, to make sure that they are at the highest level of energy efficiency. This is really important to make sure that the forms of cooling that are used are sustainable. The 3rd is to focus on the building stock. We really can't get away from buildings and the built environment as being a key solution to this extreme heat. So making sure that our buildings are well insulated, that they provide for shading, that they provide for ventilation. And then 4th, at the city level, to make sure that we have enough spaces, such as green spaces, such as water bodies, such as shaded regions that provide relief from the extreme heat for those that are outdoors.
And if you want your questions answered, you can scan the QR code here or go to any of our social media accounts where you can add questions in the comments. And of course, we can look at some of your questions in more detail. Victoria Taylor asked us about the impact that air travel has on climate change. Now, that is a very good question and one that we'll be looking at in greater detail next week. And just a little bit of good news before we go. A massive offshore development has been just announced by Germany, which not only will have huge turbines in the sea, but it'll use some of the power to create hydrogen from seawater, a process called electrolysis, which is a really big hope for a lot of renewable technology. That's it for this week. Do stay cool in a very, very hot week to come, and look forward to seeing you again next weekend.